off and running. Tonight, we'd like to continue our study, and we plan to conclude it next week. Next week, ordinarily, would be questions and answers, but I haven't seen any. So we'll go ahead and do this, and then if we get some, we'll just go ahead and make it the following week. But we actually began this study as a result of a question that was asked a few weeks ago, and decided just to go through the entire 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians, which, not surprisingly, is called the resurrection chapter. When you're learning about things in the New Testament and where things are, that's one of the things that is often brought to attention. So what has Paul done thus far? We want to review briefly the things that have been covered. First, Paul showed that the resurrection of Jesus and us from our burial in water is part of the gospel. The resurrection is part of the gospel which those in Corinth believed and obeyed. Second, Paul listed numerous, but not all, of the times. We took a look at all that we could find when we went through this, but Paul listed numerous times when Jesus had been seen after his resurrection. So there is a lot of evidence to the fact that he was raised from the dead. Third, Paul then goes into a statement that he makes that if there is no resurrection, and some in Corinth believed and or were teaching this. I believe there were some who probably were teaching it, and some brethren who were believing it, that there is no future resurrection. There's not going to be any resurrection of the dead. And if that is the case, then Christ could not have been raised from the dead. That just simply could not be. If there's no resurrection, period, then Christ is not raised from the dead. And then number 4, if Christ is not raised from the dead, a number of bad consequences occur. And there's a long list of those which we have discussed for the last several verses. But now, when we get to verse 33, Paul makes an interesting statement, and this is often quoted. But that is in verse 33, do not be deceived. Now, what follows after this, there's some variation to. Evil communication corrupts good manners. Evil companions corrupt good morals. Evil companionships corrupt good habits. Those are just a few of the ways that this is translated. So, we want to look at that a little bit more. What is Paul actually saying and meaning by verse 33? Now, this comes at the end of exploring if Christ is not raised from the dead, then you don't have any salvation, you don't have any hope, and all the other things that Paul has discussed. So what does he mean when he concludes with this verse? Well, there it is again. What is the correct translation? Communications, companions, companionships, or maybe all of those? Well, let's take a look. The word only appears once. The word companionships or communications, as is translated, appears only one time as a noun in the Greek New Testament, and this is it. Homilia. You may recognize that from the English word that we have, homily, which is a spiritual message. However, that would be giving it a precise definition. It just means homilia from homilos, which is also only found one time in the New Testament, and that is in Revelation chapter 18 and verse 17. It not dealing with a homily there. It's just a non-specific type of usage. Revelation 18:17 says, "For in 1 hour such great riches came to nothing, and every shipmaster, all who travel by ship, sailors, and as many as trade on the sea, stood at a distance. Well, and they cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, "What is this great city?" You know, that's so well disguised, I didn't even see the word in that passage. But it has to do with communion, being together, speaking together, and that's the only time homilos is used in the New Testament. Then we come to the verb form of these words, and that is homileo. The verb also derives from homilos, and it is found twice in Luke chapter 24, verses 14 and 15. And this concerns the disciples on the road to Emmaus. Let's go ahead and read those two from Luke chapter 14, or 24 rather, verses 14 and 15. Again, this is not some specific meaning like a homily would be. It's just casually mentioning conversation. Now behold, two of them were traveling the same day to a village called Emmaus, which was about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they talked together. There it is. They talked together of all the things which had happened. So it was while they conversed, same word, and reasoned, that Jesus himself drew near. Well, that's 2 of the 4 times that the verb form. See, we're only dealing with 6 times in the entire New Testament. Once in 1 Corinthians 15:33 in the form of homilia, once in Revelation with homilos, and 4 times as a verb. 2 of them we just looked at. The other 2, one concerns Acts chapter 20 and verse 11. You remember where Paul, the brethren met together and Paul preached until midnight? Well, Paul talked a long time, and that's the same word. And he is giving spiritual messages in that case. And then the final one is in Acts chapter 24-26. Felix hoped that Paul would bribe him, and so he came and met with him often and conversed with him. So we see that it is a matter of fellowship. It is a matter of companionship. It is a matter of communication also. And that's why you have such a varied translation of this verse. The meaning then would simply be this, that companions would be those with whom you would speak or commune. But now we ask the question, why does Paul give this warning in verse 33? He's been talking about the resurrection all through the chapter. Why do we have this sudden warning in 1 Corinthians 15:33? Evil communication or companions corrupt good morals. Why does he do that? What is he referring to? He is referring to listening to false teachers' evil communications. The commentator McKnight calls it profane discourses. Some in Corinth were doing precisely that. They were teaching falsely, and people were listening to it. And that's what made this entire chapter on the resurrection necessary in the first place, because there were certain men who were speaking these things to the congregation, and these things were false. And so Paul gives a warning: evil communications, being with evil men who say evil things, is going to corrupt you as Christians. Thus, the warning. When you commune with false teachers, you will probably be influenced by what they have to say. Their false doctrines frequently lead to immorality, as Paul has just shown, if you remember where we left off last week. If there is no resurrection, Paul says in verse 32, we may as well indulge ourselves in physical pleasures, for we're just going to die anyway. So let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. This is the upshot of listening to these false teachers and their false doctrine on the resurrection. There's a direct correlation between these two, and verses 32 and 33 show us exactly what Paul means when he says in verse 33. He is referring to these men who have troubled the congregation there, who have been teaching that which is not true. That not only is the doctrine untrue, it's unhealthy. Because it'll cause people to say, no resurrection, all we're ever going to get is what we have now. Let's go ahead and eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. And that's going to lead to all kinds of selfish behavior. So doctrines, false doctrines, have consequences. That's the point Paul is making in this verse. Now, the alternative is found in verse 34. Verse 34, Paul says, and you may have thought this was rather harsh, but it's not harsh in light of what has been occurring and what they need to hear. So in verse 34 he says, awake to righteousness. Don't be deceived by this false teaching which leads to immoral behavior. Awake to righteousness, and do not sin. For some do not have the knowledge of God. I speak this to your shame. In fact, this statement is so strong that when it says some have not the knowledge of God, it's the Greek word that we would get agnostic from. They have no knowledge of God. Agnostic. They do not know God. Now that's an odd thing to say to brethren, is it not? And we might marvel at that, but it reminds us that they, at least some of them, were like those in Galatia who Paul wrote concerning, I marvel that you are so soon moved away from the gospel. Well, the same thing could be said about these brethren. They have been moved away from the gospel, which includes the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And it is leading to immoral behavior. I don't know if that might just have something to do with what Paul wrote earlier in the letter. This may be the basis for what was causing the immoral behavior. But remember, it's to the Corinthians that Paul said in 1 Corinthians 6:18, flee fornication. And he had to convince them that fornication did not honor God. Well, why were they doing that if they were? Because of this philosophy. Let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Immoral behavior, well, what difference does it make if there's no resurrection? If there's no resurrection, there's no reward and there's no punishment. And so not having a resurrection has tremendous consequences in the way we live as Christians. So they needed to awake to righteousness and realize that they had been moved away from the gospel, which they had at one time so eagerly embraced. But they had lost it because they had moved away from it. And there's the part about the Greek word being agnostic. Now, one must listen to the right person, and one needs to evaluate anyone who is speaking. We should not blindly trust any speaker, but always consider what he says in light of the Scriptures. So Paul says, I speak this to your shame. When someone starts contradicting God, he is not the right person to trust. When he challenges the resurrection, he fights against one of the most fundamental teachings of Christianity. Do not listen to this individual. But now, Paul goes on to answer some questions that some of them probably had. So let's go to verse 35. Someone will say, well, how are the dead raised up? And with what kind of body do they come? What's the purpose for these questions? How many people know the answer to that? Just because we may not be able to explain, and we can't explain because we've never been there, we haven't seen it, we haven't observed it, it hasn't been described to us, and because of that, people are throwing this up. Well, what's it going to be like? Well, we don't know. But we have the promise of God, and Paul's going to give as much of an answer as he can to that. So those denying the resurrection probably are asking questions like these as sort of a taunt. What kind of body will Jesus have when he returns? What kind of bodies will we have? And not everybody has watched this debate, but the AD 70 debate, Holger Neubauer did exactly that. In his first speech, Brother Denham showed that Jesus was going to come back the same as he left based on Acts 1:9 through 11. And how did Neubauer respond to that? Well, what's he going to come back as? Is he going to be 6 feet tall? Is he going to have dark hair? That's a taunt. And they were doing the same thing in Corinth by asking these questions. When somebody starts mocking what the scriptures teach, you know you've got a problem on your hands with that brother. Well, some were behaving that way in Corinth also. Paul answers, nothing can be raised unless it first dies. But, and Jesus had taught this same principle, had he not? But what is raised is not what is sown. We plant seeds, and the body that comes forth is different than what was planted. You may go out and plant corn kernels, but you don't get a big kernel growing up. You get stalks with ears of corn. The thing that's planted is not the same as what comes forth, and it's the same thing with someone who dies and is later resurrected. We retain the same identity. We are still us, but we may look different than what was planted, what was buried in the tomb. We come forth from the grave ourselves, but our appearance is different. We're still us, but the appearance is different. God gives us a body. That's how Paul answers this question. And of course, you know that people's bodies change constantly anyway. You've seen pictures of people as babies, as teenagers, as young men or women, and through the years until they're quite elderly. They're still the same person, but the body has changed. Well, it's the same thing here. What is planted is one thing. What is raised up is something else. Let's go ahead now and read verses 39 through 44. All flesh, now he's answered the question. God gives it a body as he pleases, and to each seed its own body. But now he says something related. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of beasts, another of fish, and another of birds. They're different types. That's the point. There are also celestial bodies and terrestrial bodies. Now there's a difference in thinking. Some commentators believe that the celestial bodies is referring to angels. Cherubim, the cherubim, there's different types of celestial bodies. Other people think this is talking about the stars, and the moons, and the things that are in the heavens. Well, they're both celestial bodies. But the point is, there are celestial bodies and terrestrial bodies, the types found on earth. But the glory of the celestial is one, and the glory of the terrestrial is another. There is one glory of the sun, another glory of the moon. Of course, the moons are reflectors. The suns create light, give off light. The moons only reflect that. And as we observe stars from here, they differ in brightness. Do they not? Some are very dim, some are quite bright and easily seen. So there's a glory of the stars, and one star differs from another in glory. So all of these things are something that nobody can argue with. We know this. We understand this point that Paul is making. He goes on to say, so also is the resurrection of the dead. So that's the reason he has brought this up, to show that there are different types of bodies, different types of glories. Concerning the stars and their difference in glory, it is estimated that there may be as many as 100 septillion stars. And that's what that looks like. One with 26 zeros behind it. You're not going to count that many. Nobody's going to count that many. But it's estimated that that's the case. And by the way, that's why I always say that Big Bang doesn't cover it. 100 septillion stars, Bang doesn't quite get what happened to release all of that. That's just a very subtle and understated idea. There was nothing and it exploded into 100 septillion stars. Really? I don't know how you can get anything to explode that big. But nevertheless, that's the idea that we hear from evolutionists. But there's all of these, and they differ in glory with one another. All right. Now, Paul also writes in verse 43, or so also is the resurrection from the dead, verse 42. It is sown in corruption, it is raised in corruption. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. There is a natural body, and there is a spiritual body. And so there are these 5 points. Verse 40. It is sown earthly, raised heavenly. It is sown corrupt, it is raised incorrupt. Sown weak, raised powerful. Sown a natural body, raised a spiritual body. And one more that we haven't got to, which is later on, it is sown a mortal body and raised an immortal body. Well, these are some of the answers then that Paul has to the questions. And let's go to one more passage, verses 45 through 49. And so it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. However, the spiritual is not first, but the natural. And afterward, the spiritual. The first man was of the earth, made of dust. The second man is the Lord from heaven. As was the man of dust, so also are those who are made of dust. As is the heavenly man, so also are those who are heavenly. And as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly man. Well, these are the answers. The last section also is going to be part of the answer that Paul gives for the reason they ought to awake to righteousness and listen to the truth rather than the error that some were giving in Corinth. What do these things say? Well, Adam was a man of dust. Our bodies are like his. Jesus, though, is a life-giving spirit in that he can cause us to live on. We don't have to die with the physical body. Jesus is a life-giving spirit, meaning that he can cause us to live beyond the grave. However, the natural came first, and then the spiritual comes second. Adam came from the earth, Jesus came from heaven. The one from the earth, the one from the dust is fleshly. The one from Christ is heavenly if we are conforming ourselves to his image. We have been in Adam's image, but in eternity we shall live in the image of Christ, the spiritual. Well, Paul has that one more point to make, but the point we have seen thus far relating to death and resurrection is that the physical, the man of dust, is going to die. But it will not remain dead because Jesus, the life-giving Spirit, is going to raise all from the dead. Going back again to a passage we have mentioned a lot recently, John chapter 5, verses 28 and 29, where Jesus says, "Do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming in which all who are in the graves will hear his voice." Now, Paul's not dealing with all. He's only dealing with the righteous in 1 Corinthians 15. But Jesus went even deeper than that. All who hear his voice in the graves are going to come forth. That is, everybody is going to be made alive again spiritually. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, some that are coming forth are going to have an eternal reward in heaven. But some will come forth who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. They are all going to live forever, one in paradise, one in torment. But they shall all be raised from the dead. That's Jesus' point in John chapter 5, 28 and 29. Paul is not going to talk about those who are going to be punished in 1 Corinthians 15. He is going to concentrate on the reward aspect. But as he does, he's showing that you are sown in a fleshly way, an earthly way, a corrupt way, a weak way, a natural way, a mortal way, but you're raised up heavenly. You're raised up incorrupt. You're raised up powerful. You're raised up spiritual and immortal. Paul gave us a great chapter. Many of the great chapters in the Bible occur. Why? Because somebody was teaching false doctrine and it had to be refuted. But look how powerful the refutation is of the false teaching. And look at what we would have not perhaps been aware of to this degree if that condition had not existed. This is God making good use out of a bad situation. Is it a good thing to have people coming in and teaching error? No. But look at what it draws out in the way of spiritual teaching that's to our advantage. So we are grateful that Paul took the time to explain all of this slowly, clearly, convincingly. And we dare not let anybody move us away from the doctrine of the resurrection of Jesus Christ or of us. This evening, If you have never obeyed the gospel, resurrection is part of that. You die to sin, you are buried in water, and you are raised up to walk in newness of life. And that is a reenactment of what Jesus did. Jesus was raised from the dead, and that is our guarantee that we shall also be. And it is the basis for our hope. This evening, if you need to obey the gospel, or if you need to come back to the gospel that you obeyed but have wandered away from, we invite you to come. The Galatian brethren had been removed from the gospel. Some of the Corinthians had. Maybe in different ways and for different reasons, you have been too. But Paul didn't give up on the Galatians, and he didn't give up on the Corinthians, and we're not giving up on anyone either. If you need to come back, come back. If we can help you, let us know while we stand and sing.